They thought he was just a stubborn old man with a battered briefcase. So the officers laughed, mocked him, and took him in. But 1 hour later, when federal agents stormed the station and asked for him by name, everything changed. This isn't just a story about an old veteran. It's about secrets buried deep, duty never retired, and a past that finally came knocking. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe some heroes never stop serving, hit that like button. The town of Elmsworth was calm as the sun began to set on a chilly autumn evening. The streets were quiet, with only a few people walking around, wrapped in coats to keep out the cold. The leaves, orange and brown, crunched under the feet of those who walked by. The air was crisp, and the town had settled into its usual peaceful routine. The local police department had sent out officers for a routine patrol. They liked to keep an eye on things, even though nothing much ever happened in Elmsworth. Officer Jenkins, a young man new to the force, was eager to prove himself. He walked down Main Street, his eyes scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. Next to him was Officer Murphy, a veteran with years of experience. Murphy knew the town well and was used to the slow pace of life there. As they turned a corner, they spotted an elderly man walking slowly on the sidewalk. It was George Wilkins, a man everyone in town recognized. George was a war veteran, known for his quiet nature. He lived a simple life, alone in a small house near the edge of town. George was carrying a beaten-up leather briefcase, clutching it tightly as he walked. Jenkins nudged Murphy and nodded toward George. "What's he up to?" Jenkins asked, his voice full of curiosity. Murphy shrugged. "Just George, probably taking a walk," he replied, not too interested. But Jenkins was not convinced. The briefcase caught his attention, and he decided to approach George. "Evening, George," Jenkins said as they walked up to him. George stopped and looked at them. He nodded politely but said nothing. Jenkins pointed to the briefcase. "What's in the case, George?" he asked with a slight grin, thinking it might be something interesting. George remained calm, his face not giving anything away. He did not answer, just stood there with the briefcase in hand. Jenkins found this odd and glanced at Murphy, who was watching quietly. Jenkins decided to press further. "Mind if we take a look?" he asked. George shook his head slowly, indicating he preferred not to open the case. Jenkins chuckled, thinking George was being difficult for no reason. "Come on, George. It's just a look," Jenkins insisted, trying to lighten the mood. But George remained silent, his grip on the briefcase firm. Murphy, watching the exchange, felt a sense of unease. He knew George was not the type to cause trouble. There was something about the way George held the case that made Murphy pause. He put a hand on Jenkins' shoulder. "Let it go, Jenkins," Murphy suggested, his voice calm but firm. Jenkins hesitated, unsure. He was young and eager to show he could handle any situation. But Murphy's words carried weight. Still, Jenkins decided to push a little further. "George, we just want to make sure everything's okay," Jenkins said, trying to sound reasonable. George finally spoke, his voice steady. "I can't open it," he said simply, looking directly at Jenkins. This only made Jenkins more curious. "Why not?" Jenkins asked, a hint of challenge in his tone. George did not answer, just stood there, his eyes calm. Murphy could see this was going nowhere good. He stepped in front of Jenkins. "Let's just move on, Jenkins." "George isn't doing anything wrong," Murphy said, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Jenkins was not ready to back down. "He's refusing to cooperate," Jenkins pointed out, feeling he needed to act. Before Murphy could stop him, Jenkins decided to detain George for obstructing justice. It was a decision made out of impatience and a desire to assert authority. Jenkins told George they needed to take him in for questioning. George did not resist. He simply nodded and allowed them to escort him to the station. Murphy walked beside Jenkins, feeling uneasy about how things were unfolding. He knew George was not a threat and Jenkins' actions seemed unnecessary. But they were committed now, and Murphy hoped they could sort it out quickly. At the station, George was placed in a holding room. He sat quietly, the briefcase on the floor by his feet. Jenkins began to fill out paperwork, feeling justified in his actions. But Murphy could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Murphy decided to look into George's background. He went to the records room and pulled out George's file. As he read through it, he discovered something unexpected. George had a distinguished military record. He had served in a special unit during the Cold War. Murphy's eyes widened as he read about a covert operation called Project Ironclad. This was something Murphy had never heard of. The details were scarce, but it was clear that George had been involved in something significant. Murphy felt a chill run down his spine. He realized there was more to George than anyone in town knew. Murphy returned to Jenkins, who was still processing George's detention. "Jenkins, we might have a situation," Murphy said, his voice serious. Jenkins looked up, surprised by the tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, curious. Murphy explained what he had found, showing Jenkins the file. Jenkins listened, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern. "So, George was involved in something big?" Jenkins asked, now unsure of his earlier actions. Murphy nodded. "Seems like it," Murphy replied. Just then, the station's computer system pinged with an alert. Jenkins and Murphy went to check it. The message on the screen was strange, cryptic even. It indicated that George and the briefcase were of interest to federal authorities. The officers were instructed to hold him and await further instructions. Jenkins felt a knot in his stomach. The situation had changed and he realized he might have made a mistake. Murphy looked at Jenkins, understanding his discomfort. "We need to handle this carefully," Murphy said, his voice steady. The officers in the station felt the tension rise. They were not used to dealing with anything beyond the usual disturbances. This was different and it left everyone on edge. Murphy and Jenkins knew they had to wait for the federal agents to arrive, but the waiting only added to the unease. George remained calm, sitting in the holding room with the briefcase by his side. He seemed unfazed by the events unfolding around him. His demeanor was one of quiet patience, as if he knew this moment would come. As the night deepened, the officers at the station kept a close watch on George. They were unsure of what to expect, but one thing was clear: George Wilkins was not just an ordinary man. The briefcase held secrets, and soon those secrets would come to light. Officer Murphy sat at his desk, tapping his fingers on the wooden surface. He felt a mix of curiosity and worry. George Wilkins, the quiet war veteran, was sitting in the holding room, and the briefcase beside him was the source of all this tension. Murphy's mind kept returning to the file he had read. Project Ironclad seemed like a shadow from the past, now reaching into their small town. Jenkins, who had been feeling proud of detaining George, now felt anxious. The alert on the station's computer had changed everything. It was not like anything they had encountered before. Jenkins glanced over at Murphy, who seemed deep in thought. "What do you think will happen?" Jenkins asked, trying to sound calm. Murphy shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Jenkins. But I think we were right to be cautious," he replied. Murphy knew they had to be ready for whatever came next. He wanted to make sure they treated George with respect, especially now that they knew more about his past. The station was quiet, the usual chatter replaced by a tense silence. Officers moved around, speaking in hushed tones. The alert had put everyone on edge. They all understood that something significant was happening, though the details were still unclear. Murphy decided to dig deeper into George's history. He returned to the records room, searching for anything that might help them understand. As he combed through old documents, he found more references to Project Ironclad. The details were vague, but it was clear that George had played an important role. According to the documents, Project Ironclad was a covert military operation during the Cold War. It involved a small team tasked with a secret mission, one that had been hidden from public knowledge. The operation had been erased from official records, buried under layers of secrecy. Murphy realized that George had been a part of something much bigger than anyone in Elmsworth had ever imagined. As Murphy read, he felt a growing respect for George. The old man who walked the town's streets with quiet dignity had once been part of a hidden world, full of danger and intrigue. Murphy understood why George had been so protective of the briefcase. It was not just an object, it was a link to a past that had shaped his life. Meanwhile, Jenkins sat at his desk, trying to process everything. He felt a knot of regret in his stomach. His earlier actions now seemed rash, driven by impatience and a lack of understanding. Jenkins knew he had to make things right, but he was unsure how. The alert on the computer screen continued to flash, a constant reminder of the situation's gravity. The message instructed them to wait for federal agents who would take over the case. Jenkins felt a sense of helplessness. He was used to being in control, but this was beyond his experience. Hours passed and the tension in the station grew. The officers were on high alert, waiting for the arrival of the federal agents. Murphy kept an eye on George, who remained calm and composed. George seemed unaffected by the unfolding drama, as if he had faced far greater challenges in his past. As midnight approached, the silence was broken by the sound of engines outside. Murphy and Jenkins exchanged a glance, knowing this was the moment they had been waiting for. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs pulled up to the station, their presence carrying an air of authority. The federal agents entered the station with quiet efficiency. They were dressed in plain suits, their demeanor professional and focused. The lead agent, a woman with a calm yet commanding presence, introduced herself as Agent Sarah Nolan. Her arrival brought a sense of order to the tense atmosphere. Agent Nolan wasted no time. She requested to see George and the briefcase immediately. Murphy led her to the holding room where George sat waiting. Agent Nolan observed George with a keen eye, her expression revealing nothing. She asked to speak with him alone, and Murphy stepped back, respecting her request. The conversation between George and Agent Nolan was brief. George spoke softly, and Agent Nolan listened intently. Whatever was said, it seemed to satisfy her. She nodded, then turned to address the officers gathered outside. "We need to move quickly," Agent Nolan stated, her voice clear and decisive. Murphy and Jenkins watched as Agent Nolan and her team took possession of the briefcase. They handled it with care, aware of its significance. George was treated with respect, a stark contrast to the initial encounter with Jenkins. Murphy felt a sense of relief, knowing George was in safe hands. Agent Nolan explained to Murphy and Jenkins that the briefcase contained sensitive information tied to national security. George had been tasked with protecting it, a duty he had fulfilled with unwavering dedication. The contents were vital, and their delivery was critical to resolving a matter long kept in the shadows. Jenkins listened, feeling a mix of awe and shame. He realized how wrong he had been to doubt George. The old man who had seemed so ordinary was, in fact, a guardian of secrets that could change history. Jenkins understood the weight of George's responsibility and felt humbled by his own earlier actions. Before leaving, Agent Nolan assured Murphy that George's role would be acknowledged. The officers were thanked for their cooperation, and the federal agents prepared to depart. Murphy felt a sense of closure, knowing that George's mission was finally complete. As the SUVs drove away, the station returned to its usual quiet state. The tension that had filled the air began to dissipate. Murphy and Jenkins stood outside, watching the convoy disappear into the night. They both felt a sense of respect for George, whose quiet courage had made a deep impression on them. Murphy turned to Jenkins, seeing the change in his expression. "We learned something important today," Murphy said, his voice thoughtful. Jenkins nodded, understanding the lesson in humility and honor. He knew he had grown from the experience and hoped to carry that growth forward in his career. Back in the station, the officers reflected on the night's events. The encounter with George had left a mark, reminding them of the hidden depths within people. They resolved to treat everyone with respect, recognizing that each person might carry their own untold story. As the night wore on, Murphy felt a sense of peace. George Wilkins had returned to his quiet life, his duty fulfilled. The briefcase was now in the hands of those who could ensure its contents were used wisely. Murphy knew that George's actions would not be forgotten, and the town of Elmsworth would remember the quiet hero in their midst. Agent Sarah Nolan and her team had left the police station with George Wilkins and the briefcase, leaving behind a sense of awe and respect. The officers at the Elmsworth station were still processing the events. The night had brought unexpected revelations and a reminder of the unseen roles people might play in the larger world. The officers returned to their routines, but there was an air of reflection. Murphy especially felt changed by the encounter. He had always believed in treating others with dignity, but the experience with George reinforced this belief. He hoped his younger colleague, Jenkins, had learned the same lesson. Jenkins sat quietly at his desk, his mind replaying the events over and over. He felt ashamed of how he had approached George at first. The weight of his earlier arrogance was heavy on him. He realized he had judged George without understanding the depth of his past and the importance of his mission. A few days after the federal agents left, a meeting was called at the station. The officers gathered in the briefing room, where Murphy stood ready to speak. He looked around at his colleagues, sensing their curiosity and eagerness to understand more about what had happened. "We've all been thinking about George Wilkins and the briefcase," Murphy began, his voice steady. "Agent Nolan's visit taught us something important about the people we encounter every day." Murphy paused, letting his words sink in. He saw nods of agreement from the officers, including Jenkins, who was listening intently. Murphy continued, "George was part of a secret mission, one that most of us could never imagine being involved in. He carried a burden for many years, all while living quietly among us." The room was silent, the officers absorbing the gravity of George's story. "Agent Nolan shared some details with me after they left," Murphy said, drawing the officers' attention. Project Ironclad was a highly classified operation. George and his team were responsible for protecting crucial information during the Cold War. The details of their mission were erased from records, but the impact was significant. Jenkins shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of Murphy's words. He remembered how he had underestimated George, treating him with suspicion and disrespect. Jenkins knew he had been wrong, and the realization was humbling. Murphy continued, "The briefcase contained documents and devices crucial to national security. George was the last surviving member of his team, and he fulfilled his duty by safeguarding those items until the right time. The officers exchanged glances, understanding the magnitude of George's commitment. Agent Nolan assured me that George's contributions will be acknowledged, though the details will remain classified, Murphy added. We may never know the full story, but we can appreciate the sacrifice and dedication behind the mission. The briefing ended with a renewed sense of respect for George and an understanding of the unseen roles people might play. The officers returned to their duties, each carrying a piece of the lesson learned. Jenkins, feeling the need to make amends, approached Murphy after the meeting. I was wrong about George, Jenkins admitted, his voice sincere. I misjudged him and I regret how I acted. Murphy nodded, seeing the change in Jenkins. We all make mistakes, Jenkins. What's important is that we learn from them, Murphy replied, offering a reassuring smile. Jenkins decided to reach out to George, feeling compelled to express his gratitude and respect. He wanted to apologize for his earlier behavior and acknowledge the importance of George's role. Jenkins knew it was a small gesture, but it felt necessary. Later that week, Jenkins made his way to George's home. The house was modest, tucked away at the edge of town. Jenkins felt a mix of nervousness and determination as he approached the front door. He knocked gently, waiting for a response. George opened the door, his expression calm as always. He recognized Jenkins and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their previous encounter. Good evening, George, Jenkins said, his voice respectful. I wanted to talk for a moment, if you don't mind. George stepped aside, allowing Jenkins to enter. The interior of the house was simple, reflecting George's quiet lifestyle. Jenkins admired the sense of peace that seemed to fill the space. I wanted to apologize for my actions the other night, Jenkins began, choosing his words carefully. I misjudged you and I was wrong to act the way I did. George listened, his expression unchanged. Jenkins continued, I have a lot of respect for what you did, for the sacrifices you made. I know now that you were protecting something important. George nodded, acknowledging Jenkins' words. He seemed to appreciate the officer's sincerity. Thank you for your service, Jenkins added, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. George responded with a nod, his eyes conveying understanding. Jenkins left George's house feeling lighter, knowing he had done the right thing. He hoped his actions would serve as a reminder of the respect owed to those who have served, both in the military and in life. Back at the station, Jenkins shared his experience with Murphy, who listened with approval. Murphy saw the growth in Jenkins and felt proud of the young officer. He knew the lesson learned from George's story would leave a lasting impact on the team. The town of Elmsworth returned to its usual rhythm, the events of that night fading into memory. But for the officers at the station, the lessons learned remained clear. They continued their duties with a renewed sense of purpose, treating each encounter with the respect and dignity it deserved. George Wilkins, the quiet war veteran, continued his life with peace. He had fulfilled his duty and could now enjoy the quiet moments in his modest home. The town viewed him with newfound respect, aware of the quiet hero in their midst. As the days passed, Murphy and Jenkins often reflected on the experience. They knew they would carry the lessons learned forward, ensuring that respect and understanding guided their actions. The story of George and the briefcase had changed them, and they hoped to honor the change in their work and in their lives. George Wilkins walked through the streets of Elmsworth, his steps slow but steady. The air was crisp, a reminder that winter was approaching. He felt a sense of peace, knowing his long-held duty was complete. The briefcase that had been a constant companion was now in the hands of those who understood its importance. George's days were quiet, filled with simple routines and moments of reflection. The townspeople viewed George differently now. They had heard whispers about the night the federal agents came, though the details remained a mystery. What they knew was enough to change their perception. George was no longer just the quiet old man who kept to himself. He was a respected figure, a living testament to the hidden stories within their community. At the police station, the officers had resumed their regular duties, but the impact of George's story lingered. Officer Murphy continued to lead with his steady hand, guiding the younger officers with patience and wisdom. His respect for George had deepened, and he often thought of the lessons learned from their encounter. Officer Jenkins had taken those lessons to heart. He was more thoughtful in his approach, more aware of the assumptions he made. Jenkins had grown from the experience, using it to improve both his professional conduct and personal interactions. He had learned the value of humility and respect, and he carried that with him in every aspect of his life. One morning, a package arrived at the police station addressed to George Wilkins. It was delivered by a government official who asked that it be given to George personally. The officers were curious but respected the privacy of the matter. Murphy took responsibility for delivering the package, feeling it was the least he could do for George. Murphy walked to George's house, the package tucked under his arm. It was a small wooden box, unassuming yet significant. When George answered the door, Murphy greeted him with a warm smile. "I have something for you, George," Murphy said, holding out the box. George accepted the box with a nod, inviting Murphy inside. They sat together in the small living room, the air filled with quiet understanding. George opened the box carefully, revealing its contents. Inside was a folded flag, a letter, and a photograph of George with his old team. Murphy watched as George examined the items. The letter was from a government official acknowledging George's role in protecting national security. It thanked him for his service and assured him that his contributions would not be forgotten. The photograph was of George with his fellow team members from Project Ironclad, a reminder of the bonds forged in a time of great responsibility. George's eyes softened as he looked at the photograph. It was a connection to his past, to the people who had shared his journey. Murphy sensed the significance of the moment and felt honored to witness it. "You deserve this recognition, George," Murphy said softly, his respect evident in his voice. George nodded, his gratitude silent but clear. The acknowledgement meant a great deal, a validation of the years he had spent in quiet service. He carefully placed the items back in the box, treating them with the reverence they deserved. As Murphy prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "If you ever need anything, George, we're here," Murphy said, offering his support. George nodded again, appreciating the gesture. He knew he was not alone, that the community valued him for more than they once understood. The visit left Murphy reflective as he returned to the station. He shared the experience with Jenkins and the other officers, emphasizing the importance of honoring those who serve in ways that are not always visible. The story of George Wilkins continued to resonate, reinforcing the values they held dear. In the weeks that followed, the town of Elmsworth settled back into its routine. Winter's chill began to creep in, and the streets were often dusted with frost. George continued his walks, his presence a comforting constant for those who noticed him. The officers at the station remained vigilant, their duties unchanged yet influenced by the lessons learned. They treated each person they encountered with a renewed sense of respect, mindful of the stories that might lie beneath the surface. The impact of George's story had created a lasting change, one that guided their actions and decisions. Jenkins, in particular, found himself reflecting on the experience often. He had grown into a more thoughtful and compassionate officer, aware of the responsibility he carried. Jenkins knew he had been given a second chance to make things right, and he intended to honor that opportunity. As the holidays approached, the town's sense of community grew stronger. Festive decorations appeared in windows and the air was filled with the warmth of shared traditions. George participated in the town's holiday events, his presence welcomed by all. He was no longer just a quiet figure, he was part of the fabric of Elmsworth. The story of George and the briefcase became a cherished part of the town's history. It was a reminder that heroes lived among them, often in the most unassuming forms. The officers at the station carried this awareness with pride, knowing they had been part of something meaningful. George Wilkins continued to live his life with quiet dignity. The wooden box with its precious contents sat on a shelf in his home, a testament to his long-held duty. The recognition he received brought him peace, a sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he had made a difference. As the year drew to a close, the town of Elmsworth looked to the future with hope. The lessons learned from George's story would guide them, ensuring that respect, understanding, and gratitude remained at the heart of their community. George Wilkins, the mysterious veteran, had taught them the value of these virtues, and for that they were grateful. If you loved this story, like the video.